Welcome to the Estates Made Simple podcast with Jenna Carvello and Gordon Vanderleek. We are on a mission to simplify the world of estate administration, helping executors gain the knowledge required to manage an estate. Please note, the following is for informational purposes only and is not to be considered legal, tax, or financial advice. We recommend you seek individualized advice for your unique situation with qualified professionals.
Welcome to Estates Made Simple. Gordon Vanderleek and Jenna Carvello are excited to wonderful episode on all things estate administration. We are here today to talk about reasons you may need a different executor. Most of our episodes really focus on estate administration, and this choice of an executor really does affect the success of an estate administration. It really can make or break whether your beneficiaries are pleased with the process or whether there's litigation or missing funds. So we really wanted to highlight the importance of choosing the best executor when you are planning your own estate. And then maybe give you some ideas when you should consider a different executor. So Gord, I'll leave you start with the number one reason people might want to consider a different executor.
For me, what I see often, in fact, we just finished doing some planning for a client where the reason that they made the change was that the executor lived out of province. They were living in a different province that had moved to Alberta. So as an aging parent who wanted to move closer to the kids, and kids were in Alberta, and I think was living elsewhere, and said, okay, let me be closer to my kids. And when they looked at the documents, they said, no, we need to update them to make them relevant for Alberta laws. So we went through that process and did that. Very frequently, if you go, my estate's pretty simple, it's everything's going to the kids and then grandkids. There may not be a whole lot of change on that in the normal course, but the choice of executor can change a lot. And I find if you have an out-of-province executor, so you moved away from your choice of executor, or alternatively, if it's your child or your family friend or relative has moved to a different location, that's a good indication that you need a different executor. So under Alberta law, if you choose an out-of-province executor, so they're outside of Alberta, but we're talking about somebody who's resident in Alberta, and that's where you're going to file that probate application is going to be in Alberta. The rule under the surrogate rules is that you need to post a bond if you're out of province worth at least the value of the estate. So the court can waive that on application, and oftentimes they do, but sometimes they don't, right? There might be circumstances where they don't, where they say, no, you need the bond. The choice of a different executor could actually save your estate a bunch of money because you otherwise have to go to like an insurance company and say, I need this bond and what's it going to cost? And they'll send you a quote, and it's typically not a small amount of money, and it goes up with the size of the estate. And so I think you want to consider, or if you're looking at your will and you're reevaluating your choice of executor, oftentimes if they're further away, they live in a different province, there's a real practical reason saying we want to avoid the bonding. And then more practically, if the executor lives out of the province, they may not be here to do the work, or there's increased costs of traveling to Alberta to be able to do the work. The role of the executor is really hands-on. You may find some things you can do from a distance, but a lot of it becomes increasingly difficult. Not impossible, but just a little more work if you are out of province. Having boots on the ground is not a bad choice. So that's something to consider when you're deciding who should be executor and where are they located. There would be, all things being equal, there's an advantage to a local executor versus one that's further distance. On this point, by the way, my general recommendation is you got to have somebody at least who's minimum resident in Canada. We reference here a different province, but you definitely don't want to pick somebody in a different country because now your estate could be considered non-resident. And that has all sorts of negative tax and legal implications that you want to avoid. So assuming we're talking about somebody within Canada, if they're outside of the province, that's a good reason to consider maybe a different executor.
And that's one of the reasons I like corporate executors, particularly for clients who may be considering moving provinces in their later years of life. If they're unsure of which province they're going to end up in, lots of corporate executors can act in several provinces across the country. So you have that safeguard in place that the same executor can act without the need to post a bond or even the need to update the estate documents if it doesn't work out that way. Another reason I would say to choose a different executor is if your chosen executor doesn't necessarily get along with your beneficiaries. Any strained relationship can lead to increased strain in the estate administration. Beneficiaries who don't trust the executor perhaps get a lawyer or ask questions and really don't trust the process, and vice versa. If the executor is making decisions that the beneficiaries aren't agreeing with or making decisions without thinking through everything in a detailed way, that can lead to strained dynamics. So if there already is a very difficult relationship, I would say choose a different executor. It's not going to get better after death. Lots of parents decide to appoint both their kids because they think it'll be a nice way to mend their bond and form a deeper relationship once they're gone. But I will tell you experience, I've never seen that happen. After the parent passes away, the glue of the family is gone. And if those siblings don't get along prior to the parent passing, they're not going to get along after death. So that hope is gone. Choose someone that the beneficiaries can get along with really well.
That's an excellent point, that last point you were emphasizing about the kids getting along on that basis, because we see that often in this line of work, right? Where the kids tolerate or get along to have a certain civility, if you will, because for the benefit of the parent, maybe that's a better way of putting it. And when that parent is gone, then the relationship changes. So when you're evaluating it, it's not even how they're getting along now, but how would they get along if you weren't there? That's an excellent point. That last point you were emphasizing about the kids getting along on that basis, because we see that often in this line of work, right? Where the kids tolerate or get along to have a certain civility, if you will, because for the benefit of the parent, maybe that's a better way of putting it. And when that parent is gone, then the relationship changes, right? So when you're evaluating it, it's not even how they're getting along now, but how would they get along if you weren't there? I think can make a big difference. So that's an excellent point. Point number three that I would make is you may need a different executor if they're not good decision makers. There's a lot of little details along the way in the course of the estate administration that requires a decision to be made. And sometimes the worst outcome is no decision. It's not even that you chose wrong, but they just have trouble choosing A or B, so they do nothing. And that leads to increased costs or delay. If a beneficiary is saying, how come the executor hasn't sold mom's house? And I had a call recently about that. It had been a number of years since mom passed and the house was still not sold. Maybe the person can't make a decision about which realtor to hire or whether they should sell or not. And I'm going, okay, 2 years after the date of death, the house should have been sold. Something's going on there. Maybe, I don't know, maybe in that situation, it could be the person's not a good decision maker. They're really maybe emotionally attached to, that's the family home. I'm having a hard time thinking of it being not part of the family. So sometimes it's just, you got to make a decision. And obviously you want to do that on a discerning basis and you want to ensure that you have all the relevant information, but it would be important to have a good decision maker. And that doesn't mean you just go fast without make cavalier decisions, but a good decision maker means they're gathering all the right information. They're listening, they're getting professional advice along the way as needed. They know when they need it, when they don't, and then making informed decisions, understanding the risks, and then probably communicating well on that decision making. But if they can never make a decision and things get stalled, that's when lawyers get called. So that's what I see is usually if I'm acting for a beneficiary and there's been a significant delay, a lot of times because the person just can't make a decision and they're stuck. So that's not a good choice.
I think you need to trademark that line. When things get stalled, that's when lawyers get called. I love it.
There you go. As a result of the podcast, we come up with creative lines.
And moving on to our next point, you may want to choose another executor if your executor is conflicted, meaning they may be wearing the role or the hat of two different parties. For example, they may be your appointed executor, but they may also be your business partner. Really, if you're owning a share of a business together and your estate needs to sell the share that you've owned, you're going to be negotiating with the business partner is also your executor, so they're negotiating against themselves, which puts your estate perhaps in a very difficult position of maybe not receiving the full benefit of what it should be receiving for the sale of that business. And it just puts the business partner in an awkward position as well. They want to do what's right for the beneficiaries, but they also want to do what's right for themselves. Another example is if you have appointed a dependent as your executor, so maybe a spouse, for example, and you're not leaving the bulk of your estate to the spouse. the spouse may want to file a claim against your estate if they feel like they're not receiving enough to sustain their quality of living after you're gone. So they also would be negotiating with themselves or filing a claim against the estate, and the executor would need to make decisions regarding that. So in those cases, often, if you're filing a claim against the estate, that individual steps down and a new executor is appointed anyways. So if you know these things beforehand, really it clears a lot of issues and it ensures that your estate is maximized for the benefit of your beneficiaries.
Yeah, no, that's really important. We see that in a situation. The other scenario would be if there's a adult dependent child and they have a long-term disability, but one of the executors is also a sibling who's a beneficiary of the estate. There's an evaluation of that person's claims under the Wills and Succession Act for family maintenance and support. They can't very well be the person who's going to judge that claim or determine how to do a distribution in the managing those legal issues involved in the distribution of the estate, because they are also a beneficiary of the estate. So even understanding what are the legal issues involved in the administration of the estate and how does that affect the choice of an executor is helpful to do ahead of time. Otherwise, now you got to do an application to appoint somebody different. It stalls the estate. You got the cost of that application. It might be contentious because you've put that person in a no-win situation. Or sometimes what we see is that you have to have somebody appointed separate to be able to manage that issue, that the executor can't do it. Right. So that leads to extra costs as well in that situation. So yeah, if they're conflicted, as you say, they're not a good choice, right? Like a second spouse, right? Where there's a division between children and second spouse. That second spouse is not a good choice. They may make a claim or they may not be perceived as making independent decisions for all of that. Yeah, the point number 5 as we wrap up here, the other reason why you may need a different executor that comes to mind is they simply don't have the time. There is certainly a lot of time and effort that goes into administering an estate. I would say to listeners, if you're thinking about being an executor, or you're just starting in that role, just budget. It's going to be more than you expect. It just is the case, right? Every now and then you might get lucky and go, things went that much smoother. But more times than not, it just takes more time than you would originally budget at the front end. So you got to make sure you have the time. So from a planning perspective, if you're going, I chose this child, but they now just are moving into their career where it's just consuming them, or they travel a lot, they don't have the time and attention for this. Again, that can create all sorts of problems in the estate. And so you want to make sure, in addition to all the other points that we've talked about, that they actually have the time to devote, because it is a time-consuming kind of hands-on job. And it wouldn't be good to give it to somebody who doesn't have the time. That could take an estate that's wrapped up in 12 months, maybe it extends to 24 months or longer, right? So that's not good for the beneficiaries and creates all sorts of problems. Yeah, just thinking, if you have some choice, who has more time than not? Or if you picked a friend and now they've decided they're snowbirds or they're living in a different climate and they're away for a chunk of the year in warmer climates during our winter months, they may not be interested in flying back, or they may not have the time to be able to deal with it, right? As they move to a different phase of life where they're just not around as much.
Yeah.
So I think you want to evaluate whether they have the time.
Yeah. And I think we tend to appoint people who are capable, but often capable people are also very busy doing other things that they're capable of. And so it is a necessary thing to consider when choosing an executor. But I do have one bonus.
Surprise. Oh, our listeners are in for a treat. We get a bonus.
The thing that seems obvious but often forgotten is the age of the executor. Appointing someone your age or perhaps a little older than you is likely not the best solution, because they may not be around. There's a good chance that they could be ill or maybe pass away before you. And so you want to choose someone that's, I would say, a generation below you, your kids or below. And I think that just ensures that there's going to be someone there available and willing to act when you pass.
I think you get more longevity out of the document, out of the plan, if you follow that advice. But if you're not in that category, I think that just implies you have to keep an eye on that and maybe keep that updated a little more frequently, because that risk is higher. Another way of putting it is, if you pick a generation below, assuming all things being equal, you're going to get more longevity out of that document, out of that plan, than if you pick somebody like an aging parent versus somebody of your generation. But just recognize those are still options. It just means you not only have to maybe keep it updated a little more frequently, but also consider maybe naming alternates, right? Or ensuring that there are other resources that are available to step in. Again, you could also get the corporate executor to be the backup if something were to happen to them.
Yeah, very good points, Gord. And that's our entire list today. There's no more bonuses.
Thank you for that. And for the listeners in thinking about these 5 reasons, we could go on and maybe create others, but we're hoping that this list makes you think about your choice of executor. So thank you for being here. We appreciate you subscribing and not missing an episode. So please do that. That helps at our end. And if you have any questions, do reach out. We're happy to help those that are maybe struggling or have questions about how this fits with your situation. Again, thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.